A skeleton discovered in Iraqi cave dates back 46,000 years. When archaeologists studied the remains, what they uncovered fundamentally challenged our understanding of prehistoric humanity. This individual had lived for years, despite having a deformed arm, an absent hand, and vision in only one eye. He couldn't hunt, he couldn't forage, he had no means of self-defense. By every measure of ancient survival, he should never have made it. Yet he did. Someone brought him food, someone offered him shelter, someone chose to keep him alive. That discovery forces a question few people think to ask. If prehistoric communities cared for the physically disabled, what did they do with those who were mentally unwell? We carry a particular narrative about our ancestors, that they were ruthless and pragmatic, that vulnerability was a death sentence, that survival of the fittest operated exactly as it sounds. The strong endured, the weak vanished. For a long time, scholars largely accepted this version of events. Anyone unable to contribute, the thinking went, was simply left behind. But the evidence keeps contradicting that story. It keeps revealing something messier, more nuanced, and far more recognizably human. And nowhere is that contradiction more striking when we examine what ancient peoples did with those whose minds broke down. To begin, we need to establish something fundamental. Mental illness is not a product of the modern era. It didn't emerge alongside social media, industrial pressures, or the relentless pace of contemporary life. It is as ancient as the human brain itself, because the very neural architecture that enabled us to plan, imagine, and build civilizations is the same architecture that can collapse inward. Depression, schizophrenia, psychosis, mania, these aren't symptoms of modernity, they are embedded in what we are. Schizophrenia appears in roughly 1% of every human population ever examined, across every continent, every culture, every historical period. In a group of 50 prehistoric people gathered around a fire, statistically, one of them was likely experiencing a reality completely invisible to the others, hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there, disconnected from the shared world. So what happened to that person? The long-standing assumption was straightforward. They perished. They were abandoned or expelled, perhaps killed, because a community fighting to survive couldn't absorb anyone who couldn't pull their weight. Logical, cold, and based on what we keep finding in the ground, almost certainly wrong. Consider a woman found in what is now Morocco, dead for roughly 100,000 years. Her skeletal remains tell a specific story. She had a condition that would have caused significant cognitive impairment, likely intellectual disability, possibly unpredictable behavior. She could not have survived independently. And yet she reached adulthood. Someone cared for her. Not briefly, not seasonally, but across years. Or look at Atapuerca in Spain 430,000 years ago. Researchers identified a young individual with craniosynstenosis, a condition involving premature skull fusion that causes developmental and neurological complications. This person survived well beyond the age at which their condition would have been obvious to everyone in the group. The community knew. They chose to continue caring for them regardless. These are not anomalies. Across the world, across hundreds of thousands of years, the same pattern keeps emerging. Individuals who could not have survived without sustained support, and who did survive, not by hiding their condition, not by going unnoticed, but because the people around them made a deliberate choice. The earliest documented act of human compassion is not a painting, not a burial ritual, not a prayer. It is a disabled person who outlived all reason because someone decided their life had value. But physical disability and mental illness are not the same challenge. A person with a broken or deformed body remains recognizable. Their mind is still their own. They can still communicate, still relate, still occupy a familiar role within the group. Someone experiencing psychosis is different. Someone hearing voices no one else can hear, perceiving patterns invisible to others, speaking in ways that don't connect to shared reality, that would have been genuinely terrifying, bewildering, impossible to explain through any framework available to a prehistoric community. So how did ancient peoples interpret it? The answer, across virtually every culture anthropologists have ever studied, was consistent. They concluded it was supernatural. The person who departed from consensus reality was not viewed as damaged. They were viewed as connected to something beyond ordinary experience, to spirits, to ancestors, to forces inaccessible to everyone else. Their voices they heard were real. The visions they received were messages. Their disconnection from ordinary life wasn't a failure of the mind. It was a passage to another dimension of existence. Consider what this meant in practice. A young man in a Paleolithic band begins hearing voices. He stops sleeping. He wanders through darkness. He describes things no one else perceives. In a modern clinical setting, that presentation points toward schizophrenia. In the ancient world, it pointed toward selection. The spirits had chosen him. He was the one who could travel between realms. He became the shaman. The word itself originates in the Tungus languages of Siberia, but the concept appears on every inhabited continent, in every known culture. A figure who stands at the threshold between the visible and invisible worlds, who communicates with forces beyond ordinary reach, who mediates between the living and the dead. Researchers have noted for decades that the psychological profile commonly associated with shamanic practice overlaps substantially with what contemporary medicine would classify as serious mental illness: auditory hallucinations, visions, dissociative episodes, prolonged altered states. What clinicians call symptoms, those cultures called capacities. A 2015 study published in Schizophrenia Research made this concrete. Researchers interviewed individuals from Ghana, Vietnam, and the United States who were experiencing what would be clinically classified as psychosis. The contrast was striking. In Ghana and Vietnam, many participants described the voices they heard not purely as threats, but as familiar presences, sometimes an ancestor, sometimes a divine voice, even a source of guidance. The experience was frightening, yes, but it existed within a framework. It carried meaning. In the United States, the voices were described almost universally as hostile, random, and without purpose. Same neurological condition, profoundly different inner experience, because the surrounding culture's interpretation of psychosis shapes what psychosis feels like from within. This is not a peripheral finding. It is one of the most significant insights in contemporary psychiatry. The story a society tells about madness changes what madness actually is for the person living it. Ancient cultures, by assigning meaning and even sacred purpose to psychotic experience, may have materially changed how that experience unfolded, and in doing so, may have preserved lives in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. But this cannot be romanticized. The ancient world was not uniformly compassionate. There were cultures that understood psychosis as demonic invasion, for whom the correct response was not care, but exorcism, and exorcism failed, increasingly desperate and violent intervention. Trepanation, the deliberate drilling of holes through the living skull, is among the oldest surgical procedures known to archaeology. Skulls bearing these perforations have been found on every inhabited continent, dating back 10,000 years or more. Many researchers believe the practice was performed to release spirits thought to be causing madness. Some of those patients survived. The bone around the holes shows evidence of regrowth. They lived afterward with an open wound in their skull. But even here, the pattern holds, because healing bone means someone provided aftercare. Someone cleaned the wound. Someone kept the patient warm. Someone watched over them through what must have been an excruciating recovery. Even in the attempt to drive out a demon, someone stayed. Moving forward through time, the picture grows more complex. Ancient Egypt produced some of the earliest written records recognizable as descriptions of psychiatric illness. The Ebers Papyrus, composed around 1550 BCE, describes a state of overwhelming despair and mental confusion and prescribes treatment. Not exile, not execution, treatment. Physical remedies combined with what reads surprisingly like structured conversation. A priest sitting with the patient, listening carefully, offering interpretive frameworks for what the person was experiencing. Ancient Greece introduced a tension that has never fully resolved. On one hand, Hippocrates made a radical declaration in the 5th century BCE. Mental illness was not caused by spirits, it was caused by the brain. He was correct by more than 2 millennia. He described depression, mania, and conditions that read unmistakably like postpartum psychosis, and he argued that these were medical problems requiring medical solutions: rest, nourishment, exercise, structure. On the other hand, Plato argued that divine madness was a greater gift than ordinary sanity. The oracle at Delphi, almost certainly in a chemically altered state from volcanic gases rising through fissures in the earth, spoke in fragmented visions that the most powerful rulers of the ancient world traveled vast distances to hear. What a clinician today would call psychosis, in that context, was the most sought-after phenomenon in the known world. Rome built institutions, the earliest dedicated spaces for housing the mentally ill on record. At their best, these were genuine places of care. At their worst, Rome developed the legal architecture of guardianship and incapacity, the idea that some people required management rather than treatment. The tension between compassion and control, between healing and containment, it did not originate in the modern era. It is as old as organized society itself. Then came the Middle Ages, and the story darkens considerably. The fragile medical frameworks that had allowed some ancient cultures to approach mental illness as a physical problem were largely dismantled and replaced by an almost entirely supernatural interpretation. Madness was possession. The remedy was exorcism. When exorcism failed, the interventions became more extreme and more brutal. People were beaten, starved, isolated in conditions guaranteed to worsen any psychiatric condition, all in the belief that making the body inhospitable would expel whatever had taken residence there. It is among the most harrowing chapters in the long history of human suffering. And yet, even here, the underlying impulse persisted. Alongside the violence, there were monasteries, religious communities that ran something much closer to hospitals, that took in the mentally ill, that fed them and gave them structure. Not because the monks understood pathology, but because their theology told them that every human being, regardless of the state of their mind, carried an inherent dignity worth protecting. The same instinct that kept a man in Iraq 46,000 years ago still operating, still refusing to let the vulnerable simply disappear. In 705 CE, the first dedicated psychiatric hospital in the world opened in Baghdad. Not in Europe, in the Islamic world, at a moment when European medicine had largely stalled. Islamic physicians were practicing what we would today recognize as clinical psychiatry. They classified mental illnesses. They distinguished between different psychotic presentations. They debated etiology and developed treatments. Al-Razi, one of the great physicians of the medieval world, insisted that mental illness was a disease of the brain, not a condition of the soul, and that it required doctors, not clergy, an echo of what Hippocrates had argued 14 centuries earlier, and that too many people in between had abandoned. The first psychiatric hospital in Europe opened in Valencia in 1409. By 1547, Bethlem Royal Hospital in London had already become notorious, known by the corrupted name Bedlam, a word that entered the English language as shorthand for chaos itself. For much of its history, Bethlem charged admission. Visitors paid to observe the patients as though they were exhibits, as spectacle, as a vivid reminder that however difficult their own lives might be, at least they weren't confined behind those walls. It would take centuries more, and the efforts of reformers whose names deserve far more recognition than they receive, Philippe Pinel in France, Dorothea Dix in America, William Tuke in England, to begin dismantling that architecture of cruelty. These were people who examined what was being done in the name of treatment and refused to accept it, who argued that the mentally ill were not specimens to be displayed, not threats to be neutralized, not cargo to be warehoused, but human beings in pain, who deserved the same fundamental care that an ancient community once extended to a man with a withered arm before anyone had thought to write anything down. We haven't fully solved this, not yet. The history of how humanity has treated mental illness is not a clean progression toward enlightenment. It is the same tension recurring across every era, every culture. Compassion against fear, understanding against superstition. We still argue about how much autonomy to extend to those whose minds work differently. We still struggle to locate the boundary between treatment and coercion. We still underfund mental health services in nearly every country on Earth. But here is what the bones tell us. Here is what 46,000 years of archaeological evidence actually demonstrates. The impulse to care was always present, before written language, before organized religion, before anything we would recognize as civilization. There was a person who could not survive alone, and a community that fed him anyway. We don't know that man's name. We don't know what his people believed about him, or what they called what he experienced. We only know he lived longer than he had any reason to, because someone decided his life was worth sustaining. That is the oldest human instinct the archaeological record has preserved for us, older than art, older than ritual burial, older than any religious tradition still practiced on Earth, the choice to remain with a suffering person because they are still a person. We descend from the ones who stayed. The question is whether we still do.